This incredible true story will restore your faith in quiet resilience and transform the way you see both human grief and animal endurance. It's a story of pain endured without a sound, and of two broken lives, one human, one wild, finding a bridge to healing that no words could have built. The canyon told the first part of the story. A week after the fire, blackened juniper skeletons lined the ridges, their twisted shapes frozen mid-scream. Smoke still clung to the air like an unshakable memory, faintly sweet with burned sage. Along the dry riverbed, the ash was so deep that each footprint left a soft, gray ghost behind. Scattered across 3 square miles were the fragments of survival, a hawk feather charred at the edges, the half-buried track of a mule deer, and, just once, the unmistakable round imprint of a bobcat's paw, small enough to belong to an animal no more than 20 pounds. In this harsh desert, silence could mean many things. Sometimes it meant safety, other times it meant no one was left to answer. Before we continue, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments. If you've already felt a flicker of connection to this story, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this journey unfolds. It's one you'll remember long after it ends. The first human thread in this story belongs to Eli Moreno, a 42-year-old park ranger who knew these canyons like old friends but felt like a stranger in his own life. 6 months earlier, he'd buried his teenage son after a car accident that shattered everything familiar. Since then, Eli's days were muted echoes of themselves, checking fire damage reports, driving empty back roads, and parking his dusty ranger truck at the edges of burned-out valleys to stare at the land without seeing it. On this day, the desert reached him first through his body before his mind could catch up. His boo. It sank into the soft ash, and heat radiated off the black rock like the afterthought of a fire that refused to die. His throat tasted metallic, like he'd swallowed the landscape's grief. He paused near a rock outcropping and let the dry wind comb through his sweat-damp hair, carrying the faint scent of scorched pine and distant rain that would never reach the ground. He was good at reading signs, paw prints, wing shadows, the curl of smoke, but he hadn't expected the land to read him back. Grief had a weight in the body, and out here it felt like he'd set it down somewhere among the stones. He thought briefly of his son, of the half-finished birdhouse still sitting in their garage, and of how strange it was that even after fire, life still whispered around the edges. The first mark of the story to come was so slight that Eli might have stepped past it entirely. A small round paw print pressed into a patch of softer soil near the creek bed, just wide enough to hint at youth. Bobcats were elusive, lynx rufous, solitary by nature, hunting mostly at dawn and dusk. He knew from training that the males roamed wide, while females clung to territories only they would ever walk. Seeing a track here, after a fire, was a quiet miracle, and a question. If the land could carry the print, what else could it carry in silence? He crouched, tracing the edges of the print without touching it. The soil was still damp from the trickle of snowmelt nearby. Instinct whispered that the animal wasn't far, but he didn't call out. In the wild, true conversation began with listening. The wind shifted, and the canyon seemed to exhale around him. For the first time in months, Eli felt his heartbeat, not as a burden, but as a rhythm that belonged to the earth. Something out here was alive, waiting, and hurting, and he realized he wanted to be the one to see it. The canyon at dawn was a place of whispers and echoes, a world between night's quiet surrender and the sun's slow claim on the land. A thin veil of mist curled up from the creek that threaded through blackened stone, softening the scars of the fire. Shafts of pale gold light pierced the canyon walls, catching on the delicate new shoots of grass that dared to push through the ash. The air smelled of char and damp earth, an odd marriage of endings and beginnings. In the stillness, The land seemed to breathe again. A distant raven's call floated down the cliffs, answered by the soft splash of water dripping from a rock ledge. If you listened long enough, you could almost hear time slowing to match the rhythm of recovery. Here, where flames had stolen so much, life had chosen a careful, deliberate return. Somewhere in this quiet mosaic of ruin and renewal, Ash moved like a shadow. He was a young bobcat, his coat mottled with the earth tones of the desert, sandy browns and muted russets, though now parts of it were darkened by soot and dirt. His tufted ears swiveled independently, catching the faintest noises, the creeks murmuring, the far-off rustle of wind through scorched branches, the uneven cadence of his own breathing. Ash had always been a creature of edges. Before the fire, he'd learned to patrol his small territory under the cover of twilight, hugging rock faces and darting between junipers, never fully belonging to the open or the hidden. Bobcats are crepuscular by nature, most alive in those thresholds of day and night. But now, thresholds were all he knew, between hunger and survival, safety and exposure, past and whatever future the desert might allow. He lowered himself to the creek, moving with the kind of careful grace that only pain can teach. The pads of his paws were tender, raw reminders of the inferno that had chased him into the cave weeks before. Eat less tea. Upped at the icy meltwater, the metallic taste cutting through the faint ash that clung to his tongue. Each sip carried risk. In the wild, lowering your head to drink was a small surrender, but thirst always won in the end. Overhead, a thin cloud drifted across the sun, and the canyon shifted in mood. Shadows thickened, and for a moment, Ash seemed to dissolve into the land itself, his dappled coat blending with the rocky terrain. This camouflage was not just luck. It was survival, a quiet skill honed by generations of bobcats before him. In these silent mornings, his ancestors' instincts guided him. Freeze, listen, wait. Nearby, a lizard skittered across the stone, tail flicking like a careless punctuation mark in the stillness. Ash's amber eyes followed it for a heartbeat longer than instinct allowed, then blinked slowly. The energy for hunting was there in flickers, but the sharp edge of hunger had dulled beneath the ache in his limbs. A bobcat's body is built for short bursts, leaps up to 10 feet, sudden pounces on unsuspecting prey. But injury had turned his movements into soft ellipses, each action measured, postponed. A light breeze slid through the canyon, carrying with it the faintest smell of distant rain and the memory of smoke. It ruffled the short fur along Ash's neck, and he stilled, every sense widening. To a casual observer, he was simply a small predator at rest. To the canyon, he was a pulse of life holding steady against the immense silence. Across the riverbed, the first wildflowers of spring pressed up through the soot, their yellow faces nodding under the weight of dew. This was the world Ash knew now, a place scarred yet persistent, where every fragile new leaf was an act of defiance. He watched the petals tremble in the breeze, though he didn't know the word for hope. In his world, hope was measured in movement, in the decision to stay alive another. Ear Day. Above, the sun slipped free of the cloud, and a blade of warm light cut through the canyon to catch on the fur along Ash's spine. It turned the soot into a faint bronze shimmer, revealing the ghost of the proud hunter he had been. For a fleeting second, the land seemed to acknowledge him, as if to say, "I still see you." And far away, a pair of human boots crunched over Ash, heading in his direction, carrying a grief as quiet and stubborn as his own. Ash lay in the cool shadow of his cave, his body curled tight against the stone as if the earth itself could shield him from memory. The world outside was awake, ravens calling, wind nudging the blackened branches. But inside, the air was still and heavy with dampness and the faint, bitter scent of char. A single droplet fell from the ceiling, striking the rock near his paw with a sound far louder than it should have been. In the silence of survival, every sound was a message. He shifted slightly, careful not to place weight on his hind paw. The burned pad still throbbed with each movement, a pulse of raw pain against the stone. But a bobcat does not cry out. Pain is as private as breath. He licked the paw slowly, his rough tongue scraping across the tender surface, cleaning away soot he could not escape. His amber eyes half closed, not from sleepiness, but from instinct, showing weakness to no one, not even the shadows. In the wild, dignity is not a choice. It is survival. Ash's kind had always lived in the margins, unseen except by the wind and the hawks above. His world had been a precise map of scent trails, shaded ledges, and quiet ambush spots where rabbits lingered unaware. Before the fire, he had been patient and methodical, padding silently over stone and sand, never wasting energy, never rushing the moments between hunger and fulfillment. Now, every movement was a negotiation with his own body. A faint tickle of ash stirred near the cave mouth as the wind whispered in, carrying the smell of water and burned juniper. Ash lifted his head, ears swiveling like twin satellites. His body language was a story in itself, still shoulders, a tail tucked near his haunches, ears pivoting toward the smallest suggestion of change. The outside world called to him with a mix of promise and danger. For a moment he imagined, or whatever a bobcat's version of imagining might be, what it would feel like to run again. His muscles twitched with the memory of leaping across stone, of claws finding purchase in bark, of warm blood and life between his teeth after the patient silence of the hunt. But the twinge in his paw reminded him that memory was not the same as freedom. Instinct told him to rest, to hide, to wait. Outside, the creek sang its soft, uneven song, a sound that had become his lifeline. Water meant survival, and survival meant one more day to heal in secret. He had learned to move at dawn and dusk, creeping to drink when the world was dim enough to feel safe. Even with his injuries, his instincts guided him, crouched low, ears forward, tail steady. A predator, yes, but in this season of his life, one balanced on the thin line between strength and fragility. From the cave's darkness, Ash watched the world in small slices. A lizard darted across the blackened stone, its movements jittery and electric. Farther up, a raven perched on a broken branch, feathers glossy against the gray landscape. Life continued, even among the ruins. Somewhere deep in the bobcat's primal mind, that continuity mattered. It was the rhythm of the desert. Endure, adapt, wait for the right moment. He licked his shoulder now, tending to a patch of fur still stiff with soot. Grooming was instinct as much as comfort. It marked time, soothed nerves, and reminded his body of its own shape. Pain flickered through the motion, and he paused, eyes narrowing, whiskers trembling ever so slightly. Dignity in suffering meant stillness. Stillness was safety. From a distance, to any human eye, he would have looked like a creature perfectly at home, a wild bobcat resting in a cave, blending with the land. But up close, in the quiet intimacy of survival, his world was a careful balance of calculation and endurance. Every heartbeat measured the space between life and the risk of being seen. And yet, far down the canyon, a human heart was moving closer, guided not by instinct, but by grief and a pull he did not yet understand. Two silences, one human, one wild, were on the verge of hearing each other. The sun had risen higher, and with it came the heat that pressed against the canyon like a held breath. From the mouth of the cave, Ash's world was a frame of shifting light and shadow, the edges of survival bordered by blackened stone. He stretched slowly, front paws extended, and the motion exposed the truth of his condition. A tremor ran through his body, and his flank bore the patchy fur and raw, reddened skin of burns not yet healed. To the casual eye, a bobcat is a small predator, muscular, lithe, capable of sudden, fierce energy. But in this quiet moment, nature's illusion of invincibility fell away. The skin along his side was a mosaic of scabs and tender flesh where the fire had licked him as he fled. His paw pads, meant to carry him across sharp rocks in silence, were cracked and peeling, every step a negotiation between need and pain. He moved with the cautious precision of one who knew that each choice carried a cost. There were no cries for help. Wild animals do not plead. Pain lived in his lowered ears, in the way his whiskers trembled as he shifted weight off the worst paw. Even his breathing had changed, a shallow rhythm designed to hide the truth from predators. In the wild, vulnerability is a language of death, and Ash could not afford to speak it. The cave that had sheltered him now felt heavy with his isolation. Ash's corner smelled faintly of damp stone and his own fear, overlaid by the acrid tang of ash carried in by the wind. It was a temporary sanctuary, but also a trap, a place where healing might happen slowly, or where hunger and weakness could quietly decide his fate. A bobcat's life depends on movement. These solitary hunters patrol territories of 1 to 6 square miles, relying on stealth and endurance. But Ash's world had collapsed to a span of 20 feet between the cave's shadows and the narrow line of the creek. He knew the route by touch and memory, his paws leaving faint, uneven prints in the soil each morning. When he ventured out to drink, he crouched low, scanning for danger with the twitch of an ear and the flick of a tail. Even injured, instinct refused to let go. That morning, as he crept toward the water, the world seemed sharper, almost cruel in its clarity. The rocks were hot under his pads. The thin water in the creek was so clear he could see a pebble shift with the current. A black fly hovered over the raw patch of his shoulder, and he shook it off with a frustrated twitch. Hunger gnawed at his belly, but the thought of hunting, a rabbit, a bird, even a careless mouse, felt like trying to run through smoke. His body was not ready. This was the quiet crisis of the wild, the long, invisible hours between life and death. To the canyon, he was a single, fragile rhythm in an immense, scarred symphony. To himself, he was simply enduring. Every lick to a wounded paw, every careful step, was a small act of defiance against the fire's memory. And yet, across the stone and ash, another rhythm approached. Human footsteps, uneven, deliberate, found the edge of his silent territory. They did not belong to the fire, or to any predator Ash knew. They belonged to someone carrying a weight of their own, a presence the land had accepted before he would. The canyon held its breath. Somewhere between instinct and exhaustion, Ash froze in the dapple of shadow and light. For the first time, the space around his suffering shifted, as if the world itself was preparing to introduce two stories that had been waiting to meet. Eli Moreno had walked these canyons 1,000 times, but lately, every step felt like moving through an echo. He used to know the land by heart, every bend in the creek, every shade of juniper. But after the fire and the months of grief that followed, the canyon felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. The ground was the same blackened stone, the same sandy gullies, yet everything seemed quieter, as if the world had muted itself to match his heart. 6 months had passed since the night his teenage son's car veered off a rain-slicked road. In those first weeks, Eli had gone through the motions of life like an actor in a half-lit play, making coffee he never drank, feeding a dog that no longer came when called, driving his ranger truck along empty desert roads because home was unbearable. The park had always been his refuge, but now it felt like a mirror of his loss, scarred, hollow, and waiting for something to grow back. That morning, Eli left the truck at the trailhead and let his boots carry him down the slope toward the creek. His steps sank softly into the ash, leaving temporary imprints that the wind would erase. The smell of burned pine clung to the air, sweet and metallic, mixed with the faint mineral tang of water. Overhead, the sky was a wide, washed-out blue, and a single hawk circled slowly, as if the world still had time for patience. He paused by a boulder streaked with soot, crouching to study the ground out of habit. He had always been a good tracker. Decades of ranger work had taught him to read the desert like a living text. This morning, the page offered a story written in the smallest. of details, a faint line where a lizard's tail had dragged, a mouse's hop pattern in soft sand, and there, half hidden by the shadow of the stone, a single bobcat track. It was fresh, small enough to belong to a young adult, maybe 2 years old. The round pad, the slight indentation of 3 front toes clearly visible in the soft soil, it was a signature of life. Eli felt a flicker in his chest, the first spark of curiosity he'd felt in months. Life, right here, walking through fire's aftermath. He followed the creek bend, careful to move quietly. The desert rewarded patience, and after the fire, any survivor would be skittish. He scanned the rocks and burned branches, his ranger's eye tracing shadow and form. His ears caught the sound of a drip echoing from somewhere ahead, and with it, a faint shift of movement, a presence more felt than seen. And then he saw it. A flicker of russet and gray against the dark mouth of a cave. 2 amber eyes catching the light for a brief electric second. A young bobcat, perfectly still, as if carved from the canyon itself. Eli froze, his breath caught halfway to release. He'd seen plenty of wildlife in his career, but this felt different. Something in the animal's posture spoke to him, not fear exactly, but exhaustion. A kind of quiet that wasn't choice, but necessity. His own body reacted before his thoughts could shape the feeling. A tightness in his chest, a swallow that barely passed. He recognized the weight behind that stillness because he had carried it himself. He didn't step closer. He knew the rules. Wild animals heal and survive on their own terms, and human interference could mean stress, injury, or worse. But he also knew the land, and he knew suffering when he saw it. His grief and ranger instinct pulled in opposite directions, one whispering to help, the other reminding him of nature's law. The wind shifted, and ash swirled between them like a veil. The bobcat didn't flee, didn't snarl, just watched. Eli lowered himself slightly, resting on one knee, letting his presence settle like part of the canyon. For the first time in months, he felt something other than numbness, a thread of connection, fragile as a spider's silk. Behind him the canyon murmured with the sound of the creek and distant wings. Ahead of him, a young life balanced between wild dignity and mortal risk. Eli exhaled slowly, letting the desert air fill the hollow space in his chest. He didn't know what he would do yet, but he knew he couldn't walk away unseen. The canyon had a way of holding its breath at dawn, and on that morning, Eli felt it settle around him like a living thing. He knelt in the ashen sand across from the cave, careful not to close the distance, knowing that in the wild, approach is a language all its own. The creek whispered between them, a fragile ribbon of life cutting through the silence. Ash crouched just inside the mouth of the cave, a stillness that was more than fear. It was instinct, honed by generations of survival. His tufted ears flicked toward the wind, then toward Eli, then back again. For a long moment, neither moved. Even the canyon seemed to conspire to keep the air unbroken, save for the faint trickle of water and the soft sigh of the breeze through charred branches. From his shadowed refuge, Ash's amber eyes locked on the figure kneeling in the open. He smelled the human before he fully saw him. Leather boots, faint sweat, the mineral scent of metal from the belt buckle that caught the sun. His injured paw twitched once, a flash of discomfort he quickly hid by shifting his weight. In the wild, to show pain is to invite danger, but something about this presence didn't ignite the old instinct to flee. Eli stayed still, resting his hand on the ground, letting the heat of the blackened stone seep into his palm. He'd learned long ago that wildlife trusted consistency more than words. He didn't speak, though 100 impulses rippled through him, to comfort, to apologize, to promise he would help. Instead, he offered his stillness like a bridge. His heartbeat slowed, aligning with the rhythm of the canyon. For a brief moment, time contracted to a single thread. Human and bobcat, 2 survivors studying each other from the thin edge between worlds. Ash blinked once, slow and deliberate, a cat's language of uncertain tolerance. It was not trust, not yet, but it was not rejection either. Eli felt the smallest pull in his chest, as if some locked part of him had just cracked open. The canyon's atmosphere heightened the intimacy of the moment. Sunlight filtered in uneven stripes, catching on the lingering haze of smoke and the shimmer of the creek. The air smelled of wet stone, scorched pine, and the faint sweetness of new wildflowers pressing up through the ash. A raven's croak echoed overhead, and Ash's ears swiveled but did not flatten. He was listening to the whole world at once, weighing risk against the magnetic pull of curiosity. This was the moral crossroads Eli had feared. Intervene, and he risked breaking the fragile line between wild freedom and human intrusion. Stay back, and the bobcat might starve or succumb to infection, disappearing into the canyon's memory without a sound. The tension coiled in his chest like a second heartbeat. For months, he had moved through life numb, untouched by anything that could hurt him further. But here, before this injured creature, he felt the sharp edge of responsibility return. Ash inched forward once, barely the length of his paw, his burned pads pressed against the cool sand, and he winced, but kept his eyes on the man. For a breath, Eli imagined the bobcat could sense his own frack. Truer, the grief he carried like a stone. This silent exchange was the first thread of something fragile and new, recognition without possession, awareness without touch. Then, as if to punctuate the moment, a gust of wind stirred Ash into a ghostly swirl between them. Ash retreated half a step into the safety of the cave, but he did not vanish. Eli exhaled through his nose, steady and low, letting the canyon take back the sound. It was enough. The first moment of shared existence had passed without fear, and that was its own kind of promise. Above them the sky was turning the color of pale copper, the herald of another hot day. Eli rose slowly, brushing the grit from his knee, and began the careful walk back toward his truck. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew the canyon was watching, and so was the life within it. The seventh morning came wrapped in mist, the kind that clings to the canyon walls like memory. Eli's boots left soft impressions in the damp ash as he followed the familiar trail toward the cave. He had returned every day, always at dawn, always without expectation. Each visit was a quiet offering, a presence rather than a demand. The canyon had begun to change in subtle ways. Tiny green shoots pushed up through cracks in the stone. The creek's voice had grown stronger, fed by snowmelt trickling down from higher elevations. Even the air smelled different, less like smoke and more like wet earth and possibility. But the heart of the ritual was the same. The moment Eli reached the clearing and stopped, giving the canyon permission to decide whether it would share its secret. At first, nothing moved. The cave mouth gaped in shadow, the edges damp from the morning fog. Then, slowly, Ash appeared, his body low and careful, amber eyes catching a slice of sunlight breaking through the mist. He had been watching for Eli. The bobcat froze halfway between darkness and light, his burned paw tucked slightly to one side. For several breaths, the world contracted to 2 heartbeats and the thin ribbon of water between them. Lee lowered himself to a crouch, not speaking, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm he'd learned from the land itself, patient, steady, without threat. Something passed between them in that stillness, a silent acknowledgement that both were seen. Eli didn't imagine words in the bobcat's head. He simply felt the weight of being noticed, the way those amber eyes held him without fear. Ash blinked once, slowly, then again, a gesture as old as the species, a cat's language of acceptance. In that moment, trust didn't arrive with fanfare. It simply settled, light as mist, undeniable as gravity. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. A raven flapped overhead, its wings slicing the fog, but neither human nor bobcat flinched. Eli felt a warmth unfurl in his chest, something he hadn't known since before the accident. It wasn't joy exactly, it was recognition, the deep, bone-level awareness that another life understood his existence, even for a heartbeat. He thought of his son then, of the birdhouse still gathering dust in the garage. He thought of all the times he had sat alone at the kitchen table, wondering if silence was the same thing as emptiness. Looking into Ash's eyes, he realized silence could also mean presence. It could mean, "I see you." Ash shifted his weight, testing the injured paw, and for a brief second, he took one step toward the edge of the cave. It was a small thing, less than a foot of movement, but it felt monumental. In the language of the wild, it was an answer. He had chosen not to retreat. Eli's throat tightened. He didn't reach out, didn't move closer. He simply let the moment exist, memorizing every detail. The way morning light gilded the bobcat's whiskers, the faint steam rising from the wet ground, the smell of damp ash and pine mixing into something like hope. This was the pivot he hadn't known he was waiting for, the first thread of connection that carried both weight and promise. Ash had allowed him into his world, not as a rescuer, not yet, but as a witness. And in that permission, Eli felt the first shift of his own healing. If you've ever experienced a moment of perfect understanding with an animal, subscribe now to join others who believe connection transcends words. Tell me in the comments, what's the most profound moment you've ever shared with an animal? The sun broke fully over the canyon rim, scattering the mist and painting the blackened stone with fragile gold. Ash blinked once more and retreated into the cave, leaving Eli with the echo of their silent conversation. He rose slowly, brushing ash from his knees, and for the first time in months, he smiled, not wide, but enough to remind his face how it felt. Eli sat at his small kitchen table that night, the desert's quiet still clinging to him like a second skin. The room smelled faintly of coffee grounds and dry wood, though the mug in front of him had gone cold hours ago. On the table lay a ranger field guide, a roll of gauze, and an old leather notebook that hadn't been opened since before the accident. He stared at the pages without reading, replaying the image of amber eyes blinking slowly in the cave's shadow. The decision weighed on him heavier than his own grief. Rangers were trained to respect the wild, to let nature run its course unless intervention was necessary for the species' survival, but he also knew the fire was not nature alone. Human negligence had sparked it, an abandoned campfire that burned through thousands of acres. This injury was the echo of someone else's carelessness. Was stepping in truly interference, or was it simply making amends? He leaned back in the chair, letting the quiet of his small home press against his thoughts. His finger traced the edge of the gauze roll absently. Part of him wanted to do nothing. Walking away would be easier, cleaner, free of guilt if anything went wrong. But the image of Ash, curled against the stone, paw trembling with unspoken pain, wouldn't let him go. In that stillness, Eli felt a reflection of his own life. Surviving, not living, waiting for someone to notice. The wind picked up outside, rattling a loose panel on the porch. It carried the smell of wet earth and ash through the cracked window, and with it the memory of the canyon, the trickle of water, the muted bird calls, and that single moment of recognition. Eli realized he didn't just want to help the bobcat. He needed to. Saving Ash wasn't just an act of compassion, it was a tether to the world he'd been drifting away from. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. "Mara," he said when the wildlife rehab specialist answered. His voice was rough from disuse. "Hypothetically, if I found a bobcat with fire injuries, young adult, mobile but struggling, what's the right approach?" Mara paused. "Hypothetically? You mean you've found one?" Eli exhaled, half a laugh, half an admission. "I'm not asking for a capture, not yet. I don't want him to die out there." "You'll need to go slow," she said. "Offer water first, maybe food later. Don't force contact. And remember, he's wild. Healing doesn't always mean holding." Her words settled into him with the weight of truth. This wouldn't be about ownership or control. It would be about presence, patience, and the willingness to let a life recover without trying to claim it. That night Eli gathered what he needed: a shallow metal dish for water, gloves, and a small tin of veterinary-safe salve Mara had once given him for minor wildlife burns. He paused over each item, considering the responsibility that came with it. This was no casual kindness. It was a quiet promise to see the process through, whatever it demanded of him. The next morning, he returned to the canyon with the supplies in his pack. The sun was still low, painting the rocks in muted amber and blue. He approached the cave as he had before, stopping at the familiar distance, lowering himself into the sand so his presence felt steady and unthreatening. Ash appeared in the shadows, cautious but calmer than their first meeting. Eli slowly slid the shallow dish toward the edge of the creek, letting the sunlight catch on the water. A thread of hope wound through him as the bobcat's ears flicked toward the sound of the dish settling. This was the commitment, the crossing of the invisible line. Eli wasn't just a witness anymore. He was a participant in the delicate balance of life and survival, and somewhere deep inside, he felt the first shift toward his own healing. The morning air in the canyon was cool enough to sting Eli's cheeks as he knelt by the creek, arranging the small offering of survival. A shallow dish of fresh water gleamed in the soft light, and beside it, a strip of cooked chicken he'd prepared the night before. He'd debated whether to bring food at all. Too much, too soon, could shatter trust. But the memory of Ash's trembling step lingered in his mind. The balance between help and harm felt as thin as the mist curling off the creek. Eli kept his body low, spine curved like a question mark, his movements deliberate. Every sound in the canyon carried weight: the faint scrape of stone under his boot, the soft drip from a rock ledge, the distant cry of a raven circling overhead. He knew he had to become part of that rhythm, something the bobcat's world could accept rather than resist. Ash emerged slowly from the cave's shadow, his body language a perfect translation of instinct and pain. His steps were uneven, favoring the burned paw, and each shift of weight sent a flicker through his tail. He froze halfway to the wada, our ears pivoting toward Eli, then toward the offering. Hunger warred with caution, and the decision stretched into a long, fragile silence. From Eli's perspective, the bobcat was a study in resilience, soot-streaked fur catching the pale sunlight, amber eyes sharp even in exhaustion. He thought of Mara's words: healing doesn't always mean holding, and resisted every urge to reach out, to shorten the distance. Instead, he stayed in the sand, letting the canyon witness his patience. Finally, Ash took another step. His whiskers twitched, tasting the air for information. The smell of water reached him first, familiar and necessary. He limped to the edge of the dish, lowered his head, and drank. The simple act carried the weight of a miracle. Drops clung to his chin and fell into the sand, and for the first time, Eli felt hope replace the tight coil in his chest. Then came the harder test. Ash's nose drifted toward the strip of chicken, nostrils flaring. He sniffed once, twice, then lifted his gaze to Eli. It wasn't fear in those eyes. At least, not only fear. It was assessment, the primal calculus of trust. Slowly, almost ceremonially, the bobcat took the piece in his teeth and retreated a few steps to eat in the partial safety of shadow. Eli exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't cheer, didn't speak. He simply watched, heart pounding with the thrill and gravity of that first real exchange. This was the intervention's first success, but he knew the bond was still delicate. Any sudden move, any presumption of control, could erase the fragile bridge they'd built. The canyon itself seemed to honor the moment. Sunlight filtered through a break in the clouds, scattering warm light across the creek. A single yellow wildflower trembled in the breeze, a splash of life against the charred stone. Eli noticed everything: the scent of damp ash, the warmth of sun. On his hands, the subtle crunch of sand shifting as Ash adjusted his stance. Presence had become its own form of dialogue. but nature had its own reminders of fragility. A sharp clatter echoed from the ridge above, a loose rock dislodged by something unseen. Ash froze, muscles coiled, ears forward. In one fluid motion, he bounded back toward the cave, favoring his injured paw but still swift enough to vanish into darkness. Eli stayed kneeling, letting the canyon return to stillness before he rose. It wasn't failure. It was the rhythm of wild trust: advance, retreat, test, and return. The first intervention had left a mark not just on Ash, but on Eli too. He felt a small, quiet surge of purpose he hadn't known in months. For the first time since the accident, he could feel the edges of his own life again, defined by something other than loss. The days that followed unfolded in a rhythm of quiet persistence. Each morning Eli returned to the canyon at dawn, his boots tracing the same path along the creek, his movements as steady as the water that had carved these stones for centuries. He carried no grand tools or cages, only the same simple offerings: fresh water, a small portion of food, and the patience to let healing happen on the Bobcat's terms. Ash began to expect him. At first, the Bobcat only emerged when the wind shifted to carry Eli's scent down the canyon, amber eyes peering from the shadow of the cave. His movements were careful, deliberate. A bobcat's body is built for bursts of grace, 10-foot leaps, precise pounces, but injury had made him cautious, almost meditative in each step. Over time, though, the tremor in his gait softened. The raw pads of his paws slowly hardened as the burns began to scab and then form new skin. His flank, once patchy with singed fur and open sores, showed the first downy tufts of regrowth, soft as desert sage. The canyon itself seemed to heal alongside him. Spring crept quietly into the charred landscape. Yellow brittlebush flowers bloomed in unlikely cracks, and the air carried the sweet notes of mesquite and damp earth. A light rain one afternoon left the stones slick and dark, and Eli watched Ash step outside the cave to tilt his face into the drizzle. For a brief moment, the bobcat looked almost reborn, the water softening the soot on his coat into streaks that shimmered in the muted light. Eli's role was mostly presence. He learned to leave the salve and water within reach and retreat a few steps, allowing the bobcat to choose each interaction. Sometimes Ash would sniff the ointment-scented rock where Eli had left it, his nose twitching before he rubbed his injured flank against the cool stone in what felt like instinctive self-treatment. Other times, he simply drank and lay in the sun, letting warmth seep into his sore muscles. There were setbacks, too. One morning, Eli found the food untouched, paw prints circling in the dirt as if Ash had paced in indecision all night. Another day, a coyote's distant howl sent the bobcat deep into his cave, and Eli didn't see him for nearly 36 hours. The waiting gnawed at him, echoing the helplessness he'd felt in hospital waiting rooms months ago. But patience was the unspoken agreement between them, and he honored it. Through these weeks, Eli felt his own inner landscape shifting. Grief had made his world small and silent, but now that silence was shared. Sitting on the sun-warmed stone, he found himself speaking softly, not for the bobcat to understand, but for his own heart to release its weight. He told the canyon about his son, the birdhouse, the empty chair at dinner, the way loss had turned every familiar place into a foreign country. And though Ash never moved closer than a few feet, Eli felt listened to in a way that didn't need language. By the 5th week, the change was undeniable. Ash ventured farther from the cave, stretching in the morning sun, his movements smoother, more fluid. He tested short bursts of speed along the creek bed, kicking up ash and sand. His coat gleamed with new fur along the once bare flank, and his whiskers twitched with a liveliness that hadn't been there before. A young bobcat reclaiming his body, and a grieving man reclaiming his life, two recoveries braided silently together in the canyon air. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the cliffs in copper light, Ash did something he had never done before. He settled near the creek while Eli sat on the opposite bank, the water glinting between them. The bobcat lowered himself into a loaf, paws tucked beneath him, and closed his eyes. Trust, finally, had bloomed into presence. The canyon seemed to hum with approval, the wind soft in the branches, the smell of blooming brittlebush sweetening the air, the distant gurgle of water over stone. Healing, Eli realized, was not a single moment. It was a series of quiet surrenders, of showing up again and again until the broken parts remembered how to live. The canyon in late spring was unrecognizable from the ashen grave Eli had first walked into. Green had returned in soft defiance, vines curling along the charred rock, wildflowers painting bursts of yellow and violet against the gray. The creek sang louder now, swollen by snowmelt and spring rains, carrying the scent of life through the air. And in the middle of that rebirth, two survivors moved with a new rhythm, one on 4 paws, one on 2 feet, both carrying scars that no longer defined them. Ash emerged from the cave at first light, his stride stronger than it had been in months. His coat had regained its rich texture, a patchwork of tawny and russet with only the faintest memory of burns along his flank. He paused at the sea. Reek crouching low, and in a burst of instinct, he leapt onto a flat rock with the effortless grace his species was known for. The leap wasn't long, barely 6 feet. But Eli felt his throat tighten at the sight. It was a movement of reclamation, the wild announcing itself in quiet triumph. Eli watched from his usual place by the water, his heart moving with the same steady current. Something had shifted inside him over these weeks, something more profound than he'd expected. He'd started returning to life piece by piece, like the canyon itself. He had dusted off the half-finished birdhouse from the garage and set it on his porch, a small promise kept to a memory. He no longer felt like a man waiting for life to end. He felt like a man standing witness to life beginning again. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges and the canyon filled with warm copper light, Ash did something that broke the last barrier between their worlds. He approached the creek without hesitation, drank deeply, and then, without retreating, turned his gaze fully on Eli. The slow blink came first, a cat's sacred gesture of peace. And then, as if understanding passed between species without a single sound, Ash settled into the sand only a few feet away. The moment was almost unbearably still. Eli didn't move, didn't speak. He let the air and the light and the presence of this wild life wash through him. For the first time since the accident, he felt whole. Not because the pain was gone, but because he understood that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant carrying your scars into the light and choosing to live anyway. In the weeks that followed, the bond deepened into a quiet routine. Ash began exploring beyond the immediate canyon, returning less often, his world widening as strength returned. Eli expected this and welcomed it. He knew that love for a wild thing meant releasing before pause. Esha never formed. His role had never been ownership. It had been witness, patience, and trust. On the last morning he saw Ash near the cave. The sky was streaked with pink and lavender, and the air held that electric feeling of change. The bobcat rose from his sunlit rock, stretched in full, and gave one lingering look toward Eli before slipping into the canyon brush, vanishing like smoke on the wind. Eli stood in the hush of that farewell, a soft smile playing at the edge of his mouth. He whispered, not expecting an answer, "Thank you for letting me see you." If you've ever felt an animal change your life in a way no words could explain, subscribe now to join others who believe connection transcends species. Tell me in the comments, what's the most unforgettable moment an animal has shared with you? Eli lingered a while, the sound of the creek mingling with distant bird song. The canyon felt alive now, not just with wildlife but with something unspoken inside him. He knew the next step would be letting go completely, watching Ash return fully to the life he was meant to live. and as the wind curled gently around his shoulders, Eli realized he no longer feared the quiet. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was presence, and it would stay with him long after the paw prints faded. The morning of the final goodbye arrived with a hush that felt deliberate, as if the canyon itself knew something sacred was about to pass between its walls. Dawn spilled over the ridges in ribbons of gold, softening the edges of the blackened stone. Mist hovered above the creek, catching sunlight like breath on cold glass. Eli followed the familiar path one last time, his boots brushing through the new green that had forced its way through the ash. He reached the clearing and paused, letting the air settle around him. The smells were different now, less smoke, more wildflowers, and damp earth. A cluster of yellow brittlebush trembled in the soft wind, proof that life had returned where the find. He stayed a while longer, listening to the creek and the wind in the brittle branches. The desert had taught him that survival wasn't always loud, that sometimes the most profound recoveries happen in silence. He thought of his son, of the birdhouse finally hanging on the porch, of the weight that no longer pressed quite as heavily on his chest. Ash's survival had become a mirror for his own. Both had endured fire, both had hidden in shadow, and both had emerged, scarred but still moving toward the light. When Eli finally stood, he felt the earth solid beneath his boots and the sun warm on his shoulders. He turned toward the trail, carrying with him the certainty that healing doesn't need to announce itself. It just waits, patiently, for someone to notice. Have you ever let an animal change the way you see the world? Share your story in the comments. And if you believe in the quiet power of connection, subscribe to join others who know that love doesn't need to be loud to be real. Eli walked out of the canyon slowly, leaving no mark but his footprints in the soft sand. Behind him, the creek whispered, the flowers trembled, and somewhere beyond sight, a bobcat moved freely under the wide desert sky.